Hi, this is Karen Greenhouse. I'm going to show today a couple of graphs that you can make with our graphing calculators in Casio. I'm using the 9860, but this works with the Prism or the 9750 graphing calculator, whichever version you have. Nice thing about Casio is we have the same keystrokes for all of our graphing calculators. So if you know one, you know all of them. So we're going to go into statistics. So I'm going to arrow over here and choose my statistics button, hit execute. I've already entered my data. This data comes from an activity in our Fostering Mathematical Thinking book. It's called Brothers and Sisters. Students are to ask students in their classroom how many siblings they have and record the data. So we have some sample data here where the number of siblings is in list 1. So I've kind of identified that. And you'll see we have 0 siblings all the way to 10. But we are missing a few numbers because there were no students that had, for example, 5 siblings. So those are not in our list. The second list is our frequency, how many times students had that particular number of siblings. So for example, there are 6 students in the class that had 0 siblings. So that shows the frequency. So in our table, we have siblings and frequency. So now we want to graph. And the nice thing about Casio is you can make several different types of graphs. And this is a great thing when you're working with students and data collection is what graph's going to represent our data the best. So when I hit graph here, so you'll notice that's my option, I'm going to choose F1. And I have 3 possible graphs I can turn on. We're going to actually turn on all 3 and do 3 different graphs at the same time. So I'm going to actually set up the graphs ahead of time and so that we can kind of quickly go through each one of them. So you'll see under F6 that we have our set. So we're going to work with each graph first. So for graph 1, this is great to work with your students. Do I want, if I've collected a frequency table of number of siblings, is a scatter plot going to be the best choice? In this case, we're going to actually arrow down, and here's where I want to point out is there's so many different types of graphs you can make. Scatter plot is your standard one, XY, pie graph, and if we hit F6, we even have some more choices. So I actually want to make a box graph. So notice I can do a histogram, box plot, bar chart, normal distribution, lots of options. So I'm going to choose F2 here. So now my graph 1 is going to be a box plot. So now I have to kind of say, where are things coming from? So where is my data coming from? So my list 1 is going to be my X list. That's what I want. My frequencies are going to be coming from not 1, but from lists. So over here, see my options down at the bottom. I'm going to choose function 2, and I'm going to put in, I want list 2, and hit execute. So now my frequency is coming from list 2. So list 1 is my data, and list 2 is my frequency. And let's turn the outliers on in case we have some outliers. For example, 10 might be considered an outlier, depending. So we've got graph 1 set up. Let's hit exit. Exit always takes you back to the previous menu, and let's set up. Hit set again, but this time I want to do graph 2. So notice graph 2 is under function 2. So let's do a different type of graph this time. Let's actually do a pie graph. So let's arrow down. Pie is here under F4. So I'm going to change it to a pie. Now, pie graphs are only going to use one variable, so that's coming from list 1, the number of siblings. And actually, we don't want it to come from list 1. We want it to come from our frequency. What's the percentage? So we're going to change the data to come from list 2. So notice again, I want a list, so I hit function 1. This time I want it to be list 2. And I'm going to hit execute. So I've changed my data to be looking at list 2. I like the percentage display, and I'm not going to store the data. So we're done with this graph setup. So let's hit exit, and let's set up our third and final graph. So this is now graph 3. So we've already got a box plot, we've got a pie graph. So let's do and I'm going to choose F6 to get some more options here. Let's choose a histogram this time. So notice my choices once I choose histogram, where am I getting my X list from? So list 1 is correct. What is my frequency coming from? So again, we have to change that to be our list 2. Now, if you were using the Prism, you would also have additional resources here where you could change the colors of the bars in the histogram, but we don't have that. We're working with the black and white calculator, so that's not an option. So let's hit exit. We're actually ready to graph. So we know that each graph is going to show us something different. So let's choose graph 1. So we're going to hit F1 here. And now I have my box plot. And I can hit Shift F1 and actually trace. So I get a little moving point here, and it's giving me the minimum value of 0. And if I hit my right arrow, it goes to quartile 1, which is 1. It goes to my median, which is also 1, so that's why we don't see a line in the middle of our box there. Quartile 3 is 3, and our max is 6. And then what's this over here? That actually, this is our outlier. This is 10. We asked it to include the 10. So 10 is considered an outlier. So that's exciting stuff here. All right, so let's hit exit, and let's see what graph 2 looks like. So when I hit graph 2, you'll see that we have not the numbers. We have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and G is really small, or E is really small and G is really small. It's not showing up. And then we have percentages. So what do these actually mean? Well, this is showing us the percentage. And if we want to go back, we can go back and look at our numbers. So A, there are 6 that have 0 siblings. So if we go back to our graph 2, A represents that 6. What's the smallest percentage that we've got going on here? It's looks like E, 3%. So let's go back to our graph simply by hitting exit. And that's going to be when we have 4 siblings. We only had 1 student, so of course that's going to have the smallest percentage. So this is a great visual for the students and to kind of understand where that percentage come from. You could have them do some calculations, make a connection between what these mean and how that is represented in a pie chart. So let's hit exit and let's look at our last graph that we have, and it's asking us, so for a histogram, it's like, where do you want to start? So we wanted to start at 0 because we had 0 siblings. Why do we want the bars to be? So we can play around with that. So let's change that to a 1, and then we're going to hit execute. And so now we hit execute. It's making the width of each bar 1, and we can see the bar graph. You can actually hit exit and change the width and have students play around with it. What happens if we do a 2? Like what's the difference in the graph if we make it 2? And so we have to hit execute twice. Now it looks different. So this is a great exploration to have with students, is how can you explore graphs, and does what you see change the way the data looks depending on how wide you make the bars, those types of things. Don't always be, sometimes graphs can be deceiving because of the way they're drawn. So this is a great conversation and a great way for students to explore very quickly simply by changing some numbers. So let's hit back here to exit. When you are in either the histogram, which let's change that back to a 1, execute twice, you'll notice that you have this option for 1 variable. So let's click that and see what that gives us. And this gives you all the statistical measures. And you'll see this arrow over here. If I continue to go down, I'm going to get the quartiles, the median, and the max, and the modes. So let's hit exit. So you get that when you're in the histogram, which we did for graph 3. You also get that in the box plot. Now, with the box plot, we did the trace, and we could actually go to the statistical measures simply by choosing our left and right arrows. We could do that very quickly, but you could also hit the 1 variable and look at all the measures this way by arrowing down. So this is just a quick example of 3 of the graphs that you can make using the calculators. There are lots and lots of graphs, so it's a great, easy tool, easy technology piece to work with your students with.